Greetings, my name is Nina. Welcome back to my channel. Welcome to my yet another reading vlog. So today is October 7th and yesterday on October 6th I was out with my friend. She had a few books at her house and one book caught my attention and I decided to read it again. Surprisingly, I read that book in Russian in 2009. 15 years ago, I can't believe it. And the book is Twilight by Stephanie Meyer. To be honest, I really cannot believe how quickly I was over Twilight. Here's my history with the series. I first watched the film in 2009. I watched the first film before the second one came out. And I went to see all the rest of the films at the theater. I read all the books in 2009 and watched the films when they came out. Yeah, I kinda quickly got over Twilight. I thought that it was kinda cheesy, but nonetheless I did finish the series, both in terms of books and the films. Yes, I watched the last film, Breaking Dawn Part 2, and never looked back. Until this moment. Now, 15 years after I read the books and 12 years after the last film came out, I decided to read the book once more, this time in its original English language. I also use this bookmark. I think it fits the story well. This is the Romeo and Juliet bookmark. Very relevant, I think. I do remember those days when people were mocking the series. It was cheesy, it was lame, the main character is a bad role model for young girls, blah 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 blah. Eventually I did think the same, but now, more than a decade later, I wanna revisit at least the first book. So let's get started. So I'm at the page 9. Bella arrived to her father's house and in the book their encounter is much more awkward. In the film, not so much. Yes, in the film they are very quiet, but not that awkward as I remember. Excuse me, I have seen the film a long time ago. Also, it seems to me that in the book Charlie, Bella's dad, has a harder time relating to his daughter. The film Charlie, not so much. And on the page 9, Bella worries that she does not fit into a certain stereotype, aka a girl from Phoenix, aka tan, sporty, blonde, a volleyball player or a cheerleader. Well, that's how it's written in the book. Well, she's a total opposite and she is worrying about that. Oh, and there's also this. I didn't relate well to people my age. Maybe the truth was that I didn't relate well to people, period. Maybe this is the reason why the books got so popular in the first place. The book is surprisingly fast-paced. I think I'm going to finish this book quite soon. So I do remember people criticizing the author Stephanie Meyer, particularly because the books weren't written particularly well. I do remember that the author Stephanie Meyer was criticized for her poor vocabulary or something. Well, I think that the book is written quite well. And this is the book I would actually recommend to foreign English readers. I think if your level of English is around B1, I think you can handle this book. The film completely changed the scene where Bella receives her truck. In the book, Charlie informs Bella that she has a truck. When they get home, Bella looks over it and thanks her dad, and that's kinda all. In the film, however, Jacob and his dad Billy are present where Bella receives her truck as a gift. In the book, in the film, Charlie gets the truck from Billy. However, in the book, Billy and Jacob aren't present. I do really like this scene, this moment. We sat at the end of a full table with several of her friends who she introduced to me. I forgot all their names as soon as she spoke them. So I am on the page 16 and we finally meet the Cullens. They're not named here yet, but they're still there. And you know how different they appear in the book than in the film. In both book and the film, Bella meets them at the cafeteria. However, in the book, when she goes to cafeteria, they are already there, sitting at the table. And in the film, they are walking into the cafeteria in slow motion, just to make an effect. I do not remember who appeared first, but I do remember that Edward appeared last. Like he was the best out there, the best of the Cullens. Now when I think about it, the book is much tamer than the film. But then again, book and film are two different things. And in order to make a film, you needed to make a few effective scenes. Some really interesting shots. I'm already starting becoming uncomfortable with Bella being obsessed with their looks. His mouth was moving very quickly and his perfect lips barely opening. Okay, in the book they are described as inhumanly beautiful, and yes, we all know that they are all vampires. But Bella is so already obsessed with their appearances that it kinda makes me uncomfortable. And even though I do find kinda relatable that she forgot the names of one of the girl's friends, and now I feel uncomfortable about that too. I do remember reading New Moon back in 2009, and I do remember being uncomfortable at Bella's behavior because back then she was only obsessed with her own problems and didn't care for anybody else. And you can see the pattern in the first book already. It's not that strong as in the second one. She is way too indifferent to people, I think. And then there's this. That's Edward. He's gorgeous, of course, but don't waste your time. He doesn't date. Apparently none of the girls here are good looking enough for him. Pay attention, ladies and gentlemen. She didn't say good enough for him. She said good looking enough for him. That says a lot. You know, now I start to think that Stephanie Meyer really likes attractive people. So Bella on a biology class sat next to Edward, and do you remember the scene in the film when he looked as if he was about to vomit? It's kind of the same here. And he quickly was out of the classroom once the lesson was over. And then Bella is like, he was so mean, it wasn't fair. I usually cried when I was angry, a humiliating tendency. Also, the film changed the scene where Bella meets Mike. In the book, she meets him before the gym class. In the film, she accidentally hits him with a ball in the head. So I read the first chapter, Now. And now I'm taking a pause. I'll go back to this book later. Later is now, and let's continue reading the book. Ladies and gentlemen, we got some character development here. I sat with a big group at lunch that included Mike, Eric, Jessica, and several other people whose names and faces I now remembered. Wow, it has been one chapter and finally some character development. I am at chapter 27. You know what? I think it isn't Bella, but Stephanie Meyer herself who is obsessed with perfection. This is day 2 of Bella being at school and Edward doesn't come, however his so-called siblings are there. And here's what's written. They are driving on a Volvo and Bella mentions that they are wearing expensive clothes, the designer brands. I haven't reached page 30 yet, and when Collins and the Hale twins, every time they appear, perfection description comes along. I mean that everything around them is perfect. Perfect looks, perfect faces, perfect clothes, perfect car, yada yada yada. Sure, I get that there are rich kids in every school, however, this is too much for me. This is too much. Now I see another reason why these books got so popular. It isn't just about the shy and introverted main character, it's also about perfection too. Cars and beauty and clothes, you name it. So I am on a chapter 37, at least on this edition. Edward speaks to Bella for the first time. When he speaks to her, his voice is described as quiet and musical. Hello, said a quiet, musical voice. You know what? There's one thing that could have made Twilight even better than it actually is. And it would be if Edward kept singing. Singing to Bella, singing to others, you name it. That would be so much fun. For some reason I do not remember this description. His hair was dripping wet, disheveled. Even so, he looked like he'd just finished shooting a commercial for hair gel. I did not remember Stephanie Meyer being so funny. We're still at the biology class. Bella and Edward are having a conversation. When Edward asks Bella questions, she tells him everything that's on her mind. Well, for example, this scene. Am I annoying you? He asked. He sounded amused. I glanced at him without thinking, and told the truth again. Not exactly. I'm more annoyed at myself. My face is so easy to read. My mother always calls me her open book. Okay, that we know who Edward is and what effect he has on people. Does Edward affect Bella with his presence and his aura? Or Bella is simply like that? It's her personality. Debatable. And there's this next sentence. On the contrary, I find you very difficult to read. That's what Edward says. I was in disbelief that I had just explained my dreary life to this bizarre, beautiful boy, who may or may not despise me. Fixation on the looks, again. I think that she's in love with an image. I think that Edward is not a character, he's an image. This is kinda annoying. I really do not like this fixation on the looks that much. Now, don't get me wrong. It's not that looks shouldn't be highlighted, but not to this level, not on every 2 or 3 pages, not every time this beautiful person appears. And so finally, after Tyler's one scene, the main characters are leaving the hospital, about to leave, and finally there's a red flag in Edward. So before they were taken to hospital, Edward promised Bella an explanation, but once they were out of the hospital, he was like, oh, I owe you nothing. Oh, you hid your head and you don't know what you're talking about. Edward's nature isn't a spoiler at this point. Yes, we know that Edward is simply trying to protect his identity, but gaslighting is way too obvious. So after he saves her, they are at the biology class. There's this line: "I couldn't allow him to have this level of influence over me. It was pathetic. More than pathetic, it was unhealthy." Self-awareness. I do like that at least the first book does have some self-awareness. I didn't want to feel what I knew I would feel when I looked at his too perfect face. I'm mad. I hate your obsession with his perfectness. Sorry, I mean perfection. I am on page 63 and the book isn't that badly written. I think it's written quite fine, but I hate all this "he's too perfect." I look at his flawless face, his flawless lips, beautiful face, blah blah blah. I hate this already. A lot. I wasn't interesting, and he was interesting and brilliant and mysterious and perfect and beautiful. I think you know my reaction to this by now. And then people blame Robert Jordan for highlighting the beauty of his characters. In the Wheel of Time books, he didn't write about the beauty and perfection on each chapter, on nearly every page. Oh, I really like this line. So you are trying to irritate me to death? Since Tyler Swan didn't do the job, I did not remember that Twilight could be actually funny. Oh, and I just realized that I picked this book up in October. It's autumn. People consider Twilight to be an autumn read, so yeah. I finished the 4th chapter. I'm at chapter 5, Blood Type, and that's all for today. I'm done for today. I cannot read this anymore. Okay, Twilight is written surprisingly good. Okay, the book isn't as vanilla as I remember. However, those descriptions of the Cullens, they irritate me a lot. I hate them. And the description of Edward made me remember Robert Pattinson's interviews where he criticized Twilight. Then I think about it, he wasn't completely wrong about Edward. My head hurts right now after reading Twilight, and I'd rather go to bed. I will continue tomorrow, on the next day. Okay, so now it's the morning, and I'm going to read Twilight outside. I also have my Kindle. I carry it everywhere with me, even if I'm not using it. So I was outside, but I didn't get to read or film anything. I did not take my Canon camera with me. I only took my phone and I ran out of storage on my phone. So I'm continuing reading right now. It was hard to believe that someone so beautiful could be real. This is an ironic statement. Obsession with Edward's beauty again. Nothing wrong with recognizing beauty, nothing wrong with highlighting it. However, Bella's obsession with Edward's beauty is going out of hand, and I hate it. I should have mentioned this when Bella went to school, and I will mention this now. So Bella receives a very warm welcome. I actually like it. I like that she gets accepted quite fast. I do really like how Stephanie Meyer writes. Her choice of words is very good. There's nothing too extra and there's nothing less. And nothing except for Bella's obsession with Edward and the rest of the Cullens enrages me. Did not remember that for some reason. Yeah, I know, I mentioned that, but I do think it's worth mentioning again. By the way, I remembered that I bought New Moon in English in 2009. But back then my English skills were lower than they are now and I couldn't read the book, especially given that it was the second one and it's actually the most boring book in the series. Now, in 2024, now I see Edward's unlikely behavior, gaslighting. He tries really hard to look like a bad boy. Okay, there's a reason behind this, but his attempts to hide who he is are kinda unlikely still. I do remember the media with so-called bad boys who were actually worse than Edward. At least Edward has a valid reason to call himself a bad boy. But you know what, I was always shocked at Bella's reaction. I do remember in the film, when they're in the forest, he told her, I killed people, and she's like, okay, I wanted to kill you, and she's like, I don't care. And of course I do remember the infamous, this is the skin of a killer, Bella. How can one forget that? You know what, even back then, back in 2009, when I got into Twilight for the first time, I was surprised at Bella's behavior. Bella is 17, I was 15, and even to me it seemed so weird that she was absolutely okay with dating a killer, a dangerous being. I'm currently on page 96, I'm about to reach page 100. Now let's take a break and let's read an article from InStyle, all the times Robert Pattinson hated on Twilight. I think that Robert was the biggest hater of those films and the story in general. The article mentions in the end that later Robert warmed up to the films. He changed his mind. I am going to leave the link in the description. Right after the first film came out, Pattinson came under fire for saying that he couldn't believe the books managed to get published in the first place. He saw it as nothing more than a piece of fan fiction that Mayer had written for herself. He even went as far as saying it was uncomfortable to read. Speaking to E, he said, when I read it, I was convinced Stephanie was convinced she was Bella, and it was like it was a book that wasn't supposed to be published. It was like reading her sexual fantasy, especially when she said it was based on a dream. Like, some things about Edward are so specific. I was just convinced, like, this woman is mad. She's completely mad, and she's in love with her own fictional creation, he finished. And sometimes you would feel uncomfortable reading this thing. So my thought process of reading the books aligns with Robert's criticism. However, my case is milder. You always get weirdos like Edward who seem to attract women for some reason, he told OK via MTV. If Edward wasn't a fictional character and you met him in reality, he's like one of those guys who would probably be an ex-murderer or something. There's a lot of stuff in the Twilight world that doesn't make sense. It's like, why are they still going to high school? Like, up until last year, they are 100 years old. That's a good question, I think. I actually wondered that too. There is an explanation for this, and I'm going to address it later. Here's what he told the Vanity Fair magazine. The Twilight series brought out something primal in its fans. I can't really understand it even now. It does have an angle which is attached to something quite primal in girls. I guess people wanted to define them like, I'm a Twilight fan. That's crazy to me. I think people really just like being part of a crowd. In 2018, Pattinson told Variety that he stopped mentally progressing around the time when I started doing those movies. Actually, Robert just answered his own question about why vampires go to school. Vampires mentally don't change. They stay mentally at the age that they were turned from humans into vampires. This is the reason why they go to high school. They're mentally on the same level as a 17-year-old. Whenever anyone says Twilight is their guilty pleasure, it's like you say guilty. What you really mean is just pleasure. But then Robert's attitude started to change. It seems like with younger people in their late teens, early 20s, it sort of become quite a hip thing to like. Pattinson told USA Today. It's a fascinating second wave of people appreciating it, which is kind of cool. Okay, Robert isn't so negative about Twilight anymore. It is lovely now that the mania is not so intense. People come up to me and just have very fond memories of it. It's a really sweet thing. I think the only scary part was right in the thick of it all, when it was very intense. Now the intensity has died down, and it's just very warm memories. That's kinda correct. But then he said this in 2019. He summed up the entire franchise by saying Twilight is about this guy and he finds the one girl he wants to be with and also wants to eat her. I mean, not eat her, but drink her blood or whatever. It's not even cool to be a hater anymore, he said in 2022 interview with People, which went viral on TikTok. That's all 2010. Oh yeah, I remember those times. Everybody criticized the Twilight films, and but it was fun. And I also do remember watching a parody movie of Twilight. It was called The Vampire Suck, and it was actually a quite fun movie. It was very stupid, incredibly stupid, but fun at the same time. So I finally got to chapter 102, and finally Jacob appears. And his appearance in the book is completely different than in the film. And one thing I really did not remember at all is that Jacob had two older twin sisters, whose names are Rachel and Rebecca. Oh wait, his sister is named Rebecca Black. And yeah, I remember those times in the early 2010s. Just like everybody hated Twilight, everybody also hated the song called Rday, whose singer is named Rebecca Black. But to be honest, that song is completely hilarious. Yes, it sucks, but it's so cheesy and hilarious. You just couldn't help but laugh at that song. I heard that song for the first time on Friday, by the way, I remember so well. So apparently Bella and Jacob did not interact in the past that much. She interacted with his older sisters. The films make it seem as if Bella and Jacob were close as children. However, that's not the case in the books. Did not remember that at all. This is why it's great to revisit old stories that you read or watched in the past, because there are details you might not remember. Or maybe you can see a story in a different light. So I got to the chapter Scary Stories, and you know what? I hate Bella's interaction with Jacob. In this book, this is something minor, but then New Moon happens, and the rest of the series. When I was 15 years old reading New Moon, I hated Bella's behavior towards Jacob because it was obvious that she was using him. So in this chapter, Scary Stories, they go to La Push. Jacob is younger than Bella, she is 17 and he is 15. And since Edward isn't around, she starts sort of flirting with Jacob. And she gets this story from him on why the Cullens don't go to La Push. So Bella tells him this: "You should come see me in Forks. We could hang out sometime." I felt guilty as I said this, knowing that I had used him. This part of the sentence, knowing that I had used him, this is basically the entire relationship between Bella and Jacob. She was using him to replace Edward, and I hated this. But even without Edward present, even without Edward's influence, Bella's treatment of Jacob is disgusting. I would call it a consumerist relationship. She basically consumes him, and I hate that word. She's basically a user. Poor Jacob. He deserves better. Now it's the evening and I am still reading, and it's raining, and I decided I want to have some tea, because a book, a cup of tea and rain outside sounds good. Because when I thought of him, of his voice, his hypnotic eyes, the magnetic force of his personality. Excuse me, I wish Edward had a magnetic personality. I didn't catch it here. I only caught his perfection. I only caught his extreme beauty, or whatever you'd call it. The magnetic force of his personality. Where? My tea is finally ready. Let's take a moment and discuss Bella's reading taste. So I was surprised to see that Bella was quite a reader. Chapter 128, and the page starts with, I decided to kill an hour with non-school related reading. I had a small collection of books that came with me to Forks, the shabbiest volume being a compilation of the works of Jane Austen. My favorites were Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility, and also Mansfield Park. So Bella is heavily into classics, the English classics like the Bronte sisters and Jane Austen. With Bronte sisters, at least she's into Wuthering Heights. I do remember that the book appears a lot in Eclipse. I do remember that. And she also liked Romeo and Juliet. I do remember in the second film when Bella wakes up at the beginning of the film. The book next to her is Romeo and Juliet. You know, it is said that a book taste says a lot about a person, and I do think that Bella's taste in books gives a reader an insight into her personality. So all of these books are mostly the romance novels. They focus on relationships, and Bella focuses a lot on her relationship with Edward, and her book taste says a lot. Oh, and there's also this. So the hero of Sense and Sensibility is called Edward. That's not what's written, that's what I said in my own words. This is what's written. Angrily, I turned to Mansfield Park, but the hero of that piece was named Edmund, and that was just too close. Weren't there any other names available in the late 18th century? That moment was very funny. You know what? There's a pattern I noticed in those American books and films and TV shows for teenagers, for young adults to be exact. So when teenage girls gather, all they talk about is boys and clothes. I was a teenage girl, and I can definitely tell you that teenage girls around me talked about anything than the boys, or at least that was the last thing that came to mind. I wonder if Stephanie Meyer had a lot of female friends. Well, if she did, she would have known that young girls in general, they do not spend time talking about boys all the time. Oh, my camera's battery is slowly dying. I need to charge the battery. So I'm reading the Port Angeles chapter. She encountered the bad guys. I think the film played out the scene where Bella leaves Angela and Jessica and goes to a bookstore better than Stephanie Meyer did. So, in the book, they were already done dress shopping, and Bella went to the bookstore alone. The girls wanted to join her, but Bella was like, nah, I'd rather be alone. I stayed there for a long time than necessary, and she wanders around different bookshops. In the film, and Bella leaves the girls at the store and goes to the bookstore. In the book, I thought that the moment was way too dumb. They were in a foreign city, alone, at evening, and Bella left them. They were about to meet in an hour at a restaurant. And here's also one thing. Why didn't they call each other? So this book came out in 2005. At that year, everybody already had mobile phones. Why didn't Bella call the girls, or why didn't they call her? I just don't get it. I do find it really odd that they didn't call each other. It's even more odd that they didn't stick together. They were together in a foreign city. I don't know. I just try to keep close to my friends when I'm somewhere, even if it's in my own city, even in my own area. And then, as it turned out, that the girls ate without her. What kind of friendship is that? So I changed my clothes because it got cold. I'm continuing reading this so-called masterpiece. I read the chapter in Port Angeles. There's another change, and so there is another moment changed in the film. In the book, the infamous how old are you? 17. How long have you been 17? A while dialogue happens when they are in the car coming back from the restaurant, while in the film the same dialogue happens in a forest. I'm pointing these things out because I read the book long ago and I did not remember such details. And this is also the same chapter where this infamous monologue happens. I like the same monologue in the film better. This monologue is written even on the backside of this book, so I do not have to open it to read it to you. About 3 things I was absolutely positive. First, Edward was a vampire. Second, there was a part of him, and I didn't know how dominant that part might be, that thirsted for my blood. And third, I was unconditionally and irrevocably in love with him. I think Bella isn't in love with Edward, I think she is fangirling over Edward. It seems like fangirling and it isn't even written in a good way. The confirmation that Edward is a vampire doesn't happen yet. Edward still hints that he is a bad guy and she doesn't care. Still, she does mention that she should be afraid, but she doesn't. Okay, the same thing could have been written much better. Oh, the second line in the next chapter, Interrogations, is chapter 10. The second line is this: logic wasn't on my side, or common sense. That explains a lot. And yeah, I do need to point out one thing: nothing wrong with writing characters that have a strong impact on others. Nothing wrong with writing the so-called fangirls. Nothing wrong with that. But this aspect, the core aspect of this book, is written blandly. Okay, I know that I have said that the book is more or less written good, not bad writing, but this core aspect needed some serious editing. Where were the editors looking when they read this? Where did the publishers look? "Good morning, Jessica," Edward said politely. It wasn't really his fault that his voice was so irresistible. Is he a singer? Okay, I understand very well. I do not remember reading this line in 2009. Okay, so now it's getting late. I'm on page 180 and I will continue tomorrow. Good night. Day 3 of reading Twilight, so let's continue doing that. So they're discussing Bella's trip to Seattle, and Bella literally asks Edward's permission to drive her own truck. And he doesn't let her. Well, she doesn't object much because she wants to be with him, but here we can see Edward's controlling behavior. Back then, I more or less justified Edward's behavior as him being worried. Although even back then, it did seem to me that he went out of line. But now his controlling behavior is definitely off-putting, and no wonder people criticize this book for romanticizing such behavior. There is this scene at the gym where Bella meets Mike and he asks about Edward. He doesn't like that Bella is with Edward. And then he says something that sums up the entire series, at least the first 3.5 books. Here's the scene. He looks at you like you're something to eat. You could sum up the entire Twilight series with this sentence. Seriously, this sounds like something Robert Pattinson would say, at least back in those days. And then there's this line: I sympathize with him. It must be a hard thing to be a father, living in fear that your daughter would meet a boy she liked, but also having to worry if she didn't. How ghastly it would be, I thought, shuddering, if Charlie had even the slightest inkling of exactly what I did like. I guess that she realizes that she likes someone really dangerous, but goes for him anyway. So I reached page 200. There is actually a scene where Edward acts surprisingly very good. Sure, they talk a lot about various things. Mostly Bella tries to discover his secret, but then Edward decides to know Bella better, and he asks her favorite color. Oh, this is actually a very good scene, to be honest. He tries to know small things about her. A lot of people miss out on this scene. You'd think that this is something minor and unimportant, but I do think that it portrays Edward in a positive light, because knowing small things is a great thing. So Edward's family can't understand why Edward can't leave Bella alone. I think not only Edward's family thinks about that, but everyone around them. And then Edward says this: you are not like anyone I've ever known. You fascinate me. I have a better than average grasp of human nature. People are predictable, but you never do what I expect. You always take me by surprise. Here is, ladies and gentlemen, another reason why Twilight got so popular. Because this is the book that has the character that is made feel special. Sure, Bella takes him by surprise, but we never see that. I wish we saw that, Bella taking Edward by surprise. You know what? I'm also at the moment reading for the fourth time again Lord of the Rings, and the Hobbits take everybody by surprise, and that's believable. But here it's said that Bella takes Edward by surprise, but when? Where? I do not see it at all. So I'm on the page 216, and this is the first page where Alice Cullen starts talking. And once she starts talking, it's mentioned that she has a high soprano voice, almost as attractive as Edward's. Pay attention, ladies and gentlemen. Alice's voice is described. Well, we know what type of voice she has. Whereas Edward's voice is simply just musical. You know what? From this description, it's easy for me to imagine how Alice sounds. And with Edward, it's hard for me to imagine how he sounds at all. Does he have a tenor voice, a baritone voice, maybe bass voice? The Cullens aren't singers, but nonetheless their voices are described. We have a description of Alice's voice, but not Edward's. It means that Edward's voice type doesn't really matter as long as it's musical. Now this kinda seems like a little bit of a lazy writing to me. Yeah, I'm such a big music addict. Oh, we're halfway there. Half of the book is done in 2.5 days. You know, as the book went on, it got a little bit dull. Well, for a while after the restaurant, nothing really happens. It's mostly a description of the most mundane stuff. Sure, the book started out well, but in the middle it got, a bit off. Too much talk about the most mundane stuff, like going to the dance, doing the laundry, and in general plans for the day. Not that such scenes shouldn't be in the book, but in the middle we got a lot of them, and that wasn't that exciting to read. Well, at least I'm glad that there aren't too many descriptions of said things. I'm sure we're going to go to action quite soon. Okay, so page 220. Since I'd come to Fox, it really seemed like my life was about him. She doesn't really have a life of her own. She had the chance to have it at the beginning. Well, there were a lot of people at school, but she talked to friends and so on, but all she thinks about is Edward. I think the reason Edward is so attached to Bella is that while he can't read her mind, he knows that she mostly thinks about him. Her life revolves around him. It doesn't seem like her life revolves around him. It really was. Her life did revolve around him. No, this is not very good, especially in the second book. And yeah, this is one of the reasons why people think that Bella is not a good role model to young people. And her treatment of Jacob as some kind of consolation prize is even bigger reason to not consider Bella your role model. I thought of quitting this book multiple times. The Twilight saga in general got way overhated back in the day, I admit that, but reading this book again made me realize that the reputation that Twilight had was kinda deserved. Twilight has been out of spotlight for 12 years already. Nowadays people are warming up, but I read the book. Maybe it should not have been overhated because there were some really cool moments in the series overall, but nonetheless the series did deserve the reputation it had. I hate Bella's treatment of everyone who isn't Edward, or at least the Cullen family in general. The phone rang and I sprinted downstairs to get it. There was only one voice I wanted to hear, anything else would be a disappointment. So the person calling isn't Edward, it's Jessica. So Jessica is happy and excited, and she talks about the dance with Mike. And then Bella is like, I moved and ahed at the right places, but it wasn't easy to concentrate. Jessica, Mike, the dance, the school, they all seem strangely irrelevant at the moment. So I can understand Bella to a small point, but this is not how you treat your friends. There was a time when I was extremely busy. Well, I needed to write my master thesis, and my cousin called, and despite being busy, I still made time for him and still managed to write my thesis. So Bella is thinking about Edward. I think Edward is the heroine for Bella, not the other way around. And at this moment Bella doesn't give a fuck about anybody around her. Well, maybe to some extent cares about her father and mom, but not anybody else. Everybody talks about how Edward is abusive and controlling and Jacob has anger issues, but nobody talks about how selfish asshole is Bella. She uses everybody around her, is kinda narcissistic. Now, don't get me wrong, I also had to listen to things I considered irrelevant by the phone when I had something exciting going on. But the reason I'm pointing this moment out particularly is that all of these things aren't irrelevant to Bella at the moment, they are irrelevant to her in general. I hate Bella. She is a disgusting role model. I sensed that when I was 15 years old, and I'm sensing this now. I need a break from this book. My head hurts, literally, and I'm also cringing in this book, so no. I need a break. So I picked this book up again, and at this point I'm feeling as if I'm forcing myself to read this. I have 100 pages left, and that's too much. Just can't fathom this anymore. So they're playing the baseball, and then 3 vampires smell them, and then Edward tells Bella to take her hair down, and then there's this. That won't help, Alice said softly. I could smell her across the field. So in the film it's Rosalie who says this, and she doesn't say that softly but arrogantly. I wonder why did they give this line to Rosalie. Yes, it's evening. I still want to dump this. Even though the most exciting part starts, James is chasing Bella, but despite the fact that things get interesting in the last 100 pages, I still feel very overwhelmed, or how to pronounce it. Yeah, this is what happens when English is not your first language. You'll mispronounce things sometimes. I'm just waiting this to be over. So finally, Bella got to the dance studio, to James, to save her mother, only, spoiler alert, to discover that mother is saved and that James only used the VCR tape to trick Bella into coming, and in the book it's explained how James got to Bella, and James even gives us insight into Alice's backstory, which is absent from the film. However, the film did a great job doing the fight scene between Edward and James. Yeah, on one hand it's kinda sad that the film cut Alice's backstory and how James got to Bella. I'm still cannot wait for this to be over, and I will be done with Twilight for good. Bella says something really logical. There is a really interesting line. A man and woman have to be somewhat equal. As in, one of them can't always be swooping in and saving the other one. They have to save each other equally. Probably this is the smartest thing that Bella said in this book. She did also realize that dating Edward was probably not the best idea. That was also the smart thought, but it went down the drain because she continued to be with Edward. Okay, Alice does explain to Bella that they are vampires, they are predators, and in order to catch their prey, they have to be somewhat attractive to them. And excuse me, if there's another thing that I cannot fathom other than Bella's obsession with Edward's beauty and perfectness, well, though somewhat justified, I hate that Edward constantly says that he would eat Bella and how nice her smell is and how he is afraid to hurt her. This is too repetitive to my taste. I can't always be Lois Lane. I want to be Superman too. I actually like this. Imagine getting kidnapped by various villains all the time. Yeah, that would be really overwhelming, and I can understand Bella here, because you can't always be the victim. Sometimes you need to be a hero. Okay, I forgot the context of this phrase. Bella wants Edward to turn her into a vampire. Sure, I like these quotes. She was kinda correct. However, being turned into a vampire, not necessarily the best decision. It's better to stay away from them. So finally I'm reading the epilogue, and Jacob comes to Bella at the prom because his dad paid him $20. So Billy, Jacob's dad, wanted Jacob to tell Bella to break up with Edward. I'm sorry, Bella. He wants you to break up with your boyfriend. Yeah, Bella, we all want you to break up with him. Break up with Edward. Ladies and gentlemen, I finally finished Twilight! This goddamn nightmare is over! Yes! Yeah, now I realize that my friend that ruined my copy of Twilight in 2009 actually has done me a favor by doing so. I was mad at her then, but I'm thankful to her now. Ladies and gentlemen, I liked the book around the first 70% of it. 60-70% of it, but then as I continued to read it, I liked it less and less. I just couldn't fathom the book anymore, even though this part is very interesting because it has all the action, the confrontation between Edward and James. That's much better in the film, even though the film lacks some explanation from James. Wish it had been in the film. One of the reasons my perception of this book worsened was that it made me extremely uncomfortable. I did remember that Edward was constantly trying to reason with Bella, tell her that he was dangerous, he was afraid of hurting her, blah 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 blah. When I read this book again, I realized that he was telling her these things far more than I remembered. And like I said, Bella's obsession with Edward's beauty. And by the way, here's one logical question. Vampires in here are physically attractive to the prey, but they go to school. How come Bella was the only one who fell for Edward's beauty? Why didn't anybody else do the same? This is a good question. No, ladies and gentlemen, no, I did not like the book. Not necessarily a bad book, but it's a very uncomfortable one. For a lot of people it's a comfort book, but for me it's a discomfort book. This is a discomfort book. I've never had a discomfort book. There are a lot of books that I hated, but I've never granted them the title of a discomfort book. I really did not like Edward's antics I didn't like how narcissistic Bella was. She basically has a main character syndrome. Granted, she is the main character here, but she still has that syndrome. aka only her wishes, only her own persona, only things related to her matter. Fuck everybody else. I'm just glad that I finished it, and I really cannot wait to give it back to the owner. When it comes to the films, I do not mind watching them again. However, when it comes to books, I do not want to continue the series. Well, first of all, I do not have the copies. My friend doesn't have them either. She only had this one, and that's enough. I've had enough of this book. I think that it was better in the Russian translation. I do need to point out how my view of the book changed. I do remember the most valid criticism of this book was, "Oh no, my life is nothing without my boyfriend. Yada yada yada, he leaves me. Oh no, I'd rather off myself." Sorry for spoiling New Moon to you. And yes, this is a valid criticism. Okay, while compared to Edward, Bella has something going on in her life. She still mostly revolves around her vampire boyfriend and nothing else. She ignores everything else. And excuse me, this isn't something you should read as an impressionable teenager. I read the entire series. I borrowed the other books in the series from my acquaintance. And when I read the first 100 pages of the book, I thought I would name this book my guilty pleasure, but now I know for sure that this is my discomfort book, and I do not want discomfort books here. They're not welcome. I only want comfort books. I do give this book credit though. She did make me mentally go back to 2009 and recollect how things were back then. And people went crazy over this book. This was so popular. Okay, I will say no more. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little reading vlog. Share your own thoughts on Twilight in the comments. See you next time. Goodbye.